VLSos here. This is a video lesson for pre-algebra, compound inequalities. Let's review for a moment what we mean by an inequality. An inequality is a comparison of two quantities with any of these symbols which represent a concept: greater than, less than, greater than equal to, less than equal to, and not equal to. When we compare things in this way with these concepts and symbols, we call it an inequality. Compound very generally means together or in combination. So what we're going to talk about today is a compound inequality, bringing two inequalities together. For example, we can start with a single inequality, a simple one. We can imagine h is greater than or equal to 64. And if we thought of h representing a real-world concept like height that we could measure, then maybe we would measure it in inches. In this case, height is greater than or equal to 64 inches. We could imagine that this measurement came from measuring the heights of a basketball team, where everybody on the basketball team has a height that is greater than or equal to 64 inches. We can graph an inequality on a number line. If we're going to graph this inequality, then we're going to put our origin here, 0, and the number that's important in this inequality is 64, so we'll make a tick mark at 64. We can be equal to 64 inches. The inequality symbol greater than or equal to means that we put a closed dot here because we can be at 64 and everything above or greater. So we shade to the right to represent that. Now this is a single inequality. We don't have anything to bring together yet to make it a compound inequality. So we're going to include another simple inequality. We're going to write down the idea that h, height, is less than or equal to 92 inches. Again, if we imagine that these inequalities came from measurements in the real world, we could imagine that we're measuring the heights of a basketball team, where the players are all greater than 64 inches, and there may be one player that's exactly 64 inches in height, but at the same time, all of the players are less than or equal to 92 inches in height. So we have a range here. Before we bring it together, let's graph the second inequality. We'll put a tick mark at 0 and a tick mark at 92. We can be equal to 92 with this less than or equal to symbol, so we put a closed dot there. And to represent all of the heights that are less than 92, we shade to the left, less than direction. So here we have two inequalities, two number lines, graphs of those inequalities. Let's bring them together. We can bring these two together in a compound inequality or a double inequality by writing h and putting h in between a low number and a high number with these two inequality symbols. So h is in the middle, and the low number goes on the left, the higher number goes on the right. H is in between 64 and 92. H is greater than or equal to 64 and less than or equal to 92. Notice that this symbol here, this is technically the less than or equal to symbol. When we read it, 64 is less than or equal to h. So if we think about h is going to be greater than the 64, even though it's on the right side. So we've used the correct symbol, but the concept here is h is greater than 64 and less than 92. We call this a double inequality. There are two inequality symbols in this expression. And so we call it a double. And we can bring together the two inequalities above into a single graph to represent all the values between 64 and 92. Put a tick mark at 0, put a tick mark at the lower number 64, a tick mark at the other important number 92. And we're going to bring these two graphs together by thinking of what is represented on both graphs at the same time. 64 is represented here because there's a closed dot and it's in the shaded region of the second graph. So it needs to be represented on our compound graph. 92 is also a location that we can be at on the second graph. It's in the shaded region of the first, so we need to include it in our compound graph. All of the numbers between 64 and 92 are included in both graphs in the shaded regions, but we don't shade above 92 or below 64. And the reason for that is because all the numbers above 92 is represented only in the first graph, not in the second. So if we're going to bring together these graphs to be a graph that includes everything that's included in both, then we don't shade above 92 and we don't shade below 64. This graph represents all of the values between 64 and 92. This is a graph of this double inequality. We can also call this representation an intersection. This graph is an intersection of the two above. It's only the graph of the points that are included in both. There's another word called union, which has a related concept but is slightly different than this presentation that we'll talk about in the future.